Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 493rd episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Hello, everyone. I want to take a few minutes to talk to you about how we make the Urban Farm Podcast come to life. My team and I pour our time, hearts, and dollars into every episode to bring you food-growing education and inspiration every week, and we love doing it. I see firsthand how food growing changes people's lives for the better, and I've made it my mission to spread the knowledge far and wide. By creating this podcast, I have the great privilege of interviewing some absolutely amazing people and providing a platform for you to learn from their experiences and expertise. The impact that this work has on the global food consciousness community is extraordinary. This is all thanks to my team and their efforts. 5 of us that work every week to find guests, set up interviews, write out questions, prepare show notes, edit episodes, and more. We've tried partnering with companies and running ads to pay for our work, but something about the ad model just doesn't feel right to me. If I'm advocating for something, I want it to be something I truly love and believe in. So I've decided to try a different model, one that I believe is possible to pay our team and bring even more value while keeping the podcast free and accessible to everyone. So instead of selling ads, we have created the Urban Farm Podcast Patron Program. If you find value in our podcast, you can go even deeper by becoming a member of our patron community. In exchange for subscribing, you will receive content and bonuses far beyond the free podcast episodes we offer. No matter what level you subscribe at, I'm committed to making sure the value you receive goes far beyond what you contribute. Did you know that the Urban Farm Podcast is not my first? Over a decade ago, my friend Amy and I hosted the Freshly Green podcast, 50 episodes of everything green. As an Urban Farm Podcast patron, you will get access to them, plus cool things such as discounts on Urban Farm U online courses and access to our private Facebook community where you can interact with other food growers and share stories and advice. My favorite offering for our patrons is our monthly Q&As with Urban Farm U's Advanced Gardener team, where we answer your questions live. It's basically having your own private gardener at your fingertips. I'm excited for the mutual exchange that comes from this model. And when you support the Urban Farm Podcast, we support you to take your garden to the next level and beyond. The Urban Farm Podcast will remain free, and I hope that those of you that believe in what we're doing and are excited by our patron benefits will take advantage of what we're offering. I truly believe this model of support will be a win-win all around. For more details about member benefits and to sign up to pledge your support, go to urbanfarmpodcast.org. Thanks for sticking with me through this message. Now let's get to the episode. Today on our podcast, we have someone who is researching how urban farmers and gardeners can increase the performance of their landscapes. We're talking with returning guest Scott Murray about active carbon sequestration. Scott has 46 years of organic agriculture production experience in the United States and Mexico. He has a multitude of experience with conservation, food production, and environmental leadership, including serving as an elected California conservation official for the last 27 years. Scott also specializes in farmland preservation projects utilizing smart growth principles. These days, he does farm creation and consulting as his primary work, including work on a farm growing coffee in Southern California, which had its first harvest and sold out in one day for $796 a pound. Wow. So we got to meet Scott back in 2015 for podcast number 11 and back again in 2018 for podcast episode 352. Welcome back to the show today, Scott. Are you ready to rock?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. So you called me the other day and said you wanted to do something about carbon sequestration and planting trees. So let's start with the term active carbon sequestration. What are you talking about?
Well, it's what a tree does every day. It breathes in oxygen It draws water up through its roots and respires that through its body. And as it's breathing in that oxygen, it's making carbon to build the strength of the tree. And so when it breathes in oxygen, it can actually breathe in carbon dioxide as well, and it releases oxygen in excess. And what we get is we get more carbon in the soil and more carbon in the plant material. And why is this important?
That's what I was going to ask you, actually. It's like, so we're hearing from an environmental perspective in the news that we have a carbon problem in the atmosphere. This is what this is addressing, right?
Yes.
How?
Well, we have a series of farming strategies. They're called practices that the USDA and the National Resource Conservation Service has identified and helps farmers with and does research on. 17 of those practices are specialized in improving soil carbon and improving plant growth, which improves plant carbon. So right now, we have, as a world community, we've been doing practices like burning coal and wood and oil, and those things release excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And right now, today, we have about 205 gigatons of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and now it's causing us serious problems. It's raising the average temperature. It's starting to increase the melting of our glaciers and sea ice, and the whole series of problems that we're starting to see from this are interlocked and cascading, which means they get worse and worse as we go.
Interesting. So there's a domino effect that's happening here, right?
Yes. And so what we're concerned about is how do we reduce the carbon? Well, there's two parts of what are called carbon action plans. And these days, the federal government, state governments, city governments, county governments, and business organizations are developing carbon action plans because we all contribute on a daily basis. We have a carbon budget for our own lives. If we have to drive our car to work, for example, we can calculate how much carbon, on average, that commute releases into the atmosphere. And we use electrical lights, for example, that are not from renewable sources, but from burning of oil or coal or natural gas. That releases carbon. So we, every day, every American has their own carbon budget. Every city and every community, every state, and every nation in the world has a carbon budget. But our carbon action plans are primarily focused on reducing our contributions of carbon to the atmosphere. Now, this is very, very important. We have to figure out how we can progress as humanity on this little planet that's ours by changing our ways and reducing our use of burning, especially burning of fossil fuels. And the problem is that all of our modern society is based on those methods right now.
Right.
So it's difficult to even slow that. Just in the last 20 years where we've been focusing on slowing it, we're still creeping ahead. So the balance to this is something that is usually mentioned in carbon action plans, but it's sort of just a sub-chapter. Oh, plant trees. Well, will planting trees literally save us from overheating the planet and causing massive climatic shifts that we really don't know how much that will affect us? One of the things that I'm focused on is the melting of ice. If we melt all the ice around the world, the sea level could go up by 240 to 280 feet.
Wow.
And just for the United States, that will have a significant impact because about 55% of our population lives in what are called the tidelands,
right?
Close to the coasts and in other low-lying areas. About 50% of our agriculture is in those areas, and about 50% of our industry. Think of an oil terminal, for example, on the edge of, a port. That would be over 100 feet underwater if they don't raise it, or actually move it inland to a location that's maybe 300 feet above the sea level that we have now. So this is a challenge for our whole world, and it is partly a technological solution where we've done things like invent solar electric cells that now are almost, in most areas, more cost-effective than burning fossil fuels, and that's a really good sign. And we have now electric cars, and if electric cars are recharged by, non-fossil fuel electricity, there's a very low impact of driving those kind of vehicles. So our future might have a lot of electric cars. But what do we do right now? Because they say when the carbon is released in the atmosphere, in natural processes, it takes up to 300 years to break down and no longer be a greenhouse gas. And what we mean by a greenhouse gas is that carbon, those particles in the atmosphere, reflect heat that normally would radiate back from Earth out into space. But these particles in the atmosphere keep that heat in like an insulating blanket.
Right.
So I've been an organic farmer 47 years now, and I have a solution right under my feet, because as an organic farmer, we literally build soil carbon as our practices.
Well, that's what makes healthy soil, right?
Yes, and it increases the water holding capacity of the soil, and it helps the soil biology to thrive. So here in California, we have a project called the Carbon Farming Initiative, and it has gotten started by working with enhancing the carbon performance of pasture land for grass-fed cattle and other grass-fed animals. By taking 1 acre of pasture and putting 20 tons of nutritive compost on it, so that's made with an animal manure, for example, not just green waste.
Right.
We spread that evenly out a half-inch thick, and we have noticed in scientific studies here in California that will quadruple the carbon performance of the soil. It will quadruple the carbon in the soil. It will quadruple the water holding capacity of the soil. And then what the farmer gets is much more healthier grass to feed his animals. Now, how do we expand that? Does that work with other kinds of vegetation? And the fact is, yes. All the different vegetation that we grow, from vegetables in our garden to fruit trees on our property, to the pretty ornamental trees that might line our street, to the forests on our planet, and including other things like ponds that grow algae and swamps and prairie. Every one of these ecosystems sequesters carbon dioxide into the soil.
There's a link here between compost and sequestering carbon. How does that happen? So I'm going to put a half inch of really good compost on my garden. What is the process by which that carbon gets sequestered?
Well, in this particular case, the compost acts almost as a homeopathic medication for the soil. It contains various soil microorganisms that help the compost break down. It contains stabilized nutrients, which are the food for those soil microorganisms. So when we spread it on the ground, it literally feeds the soil, and it feeds the soil life. And some of the soil life actually sequester carbon themselves, and others do things that support plants, which also sequester carbon.
Now, trees actually are a better sequesterer of carbon, are they not?
Well, only because they're bigger.
Ah, okay.
Right? So what we mean by this is I have planted cover crop, for example, on some garden beds that I used this year to grow crops. And then at the end of the season, I pulled out the crop and I immediately planted seeds for a cover crop that was oats and field peas. And the peas have nitrogen-fixing bacteria in them, in the nodules in the soil, they need a healthy soil, which I've been building for years. Then these peas can do their job of growing and supporting these nodules on their roots with the bacteria that fix carbon out of the atmosphere and provide it as food for the plant to grow on, literally feeding the plants.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens between a pea plant and a tree is the pea plant is pretty short-lived, maybe 6 months.
Right.
It actually can sequester a lot of carbon during that time, and then it can be stabilized by composting the plants and using the fruits. Now we look over here at every other plant in our garden, each one like a shrub. It does more than a pea plant. But when we get to trees, they are the longest term and largest organisms that we can stimulate to sequester carbon from the atmosphere for us. And the way that happens is that when we plant the tree, as it starts to grow, as it builds the wood, it's literally sequestering carbon for a very, very long term in the wood. And that is the mechanism that we're looking for in terms of planting trees. But it's also one of the big dangers we have. In the past couple of weeks here in California, we're in our fire season with our Diablo and our Santa Ana winds. So one of the disadvantages of the fires is that when the wood is burned, it releases that sequestered carbon back into the atmosphere.
Right.
So that's a natural cycle. But what we need to do, we have the opportunity right now to step up and work with nature to change the complete dynamic of this problem of too much atmospheric carbon dioxide.
So before you go there, this is a two-step process. And mainly, and I'm just reiterating what you said, mainly what we do is we look how to reduce our carbon output. But and what you said was that the planting of trees is usually a footnote in the reports. I think those are the exact words you used a little while ago. And what you're about ready to propose is something that you found that talks about planting 1 trillion trees. So that's where we're going next, right?
Yep, you got it.
Excellent. So how many is 1 trillion? Let's start there.
Well, it's 1,000 billion.
Billion, yeah. 1,000 billion trees. Okay, and just for clarity here, 1 billion is 1,000 million.
Right.
That's a lot of trees.
Break it back. That still is a lot of trees.
That's a lot of trees. But for my listeners, they know that I love epic goals. So let's talk about planting 1 trillion trees and where this program came from.
About 10 years ago, the United Nations UN Environmental Fund started a project called the Billion Tree Planting Program. And they've just been encouraging people all over the world to plant trees around where they live, especially so the benefits come directly to them. And they've created a really interesting cumulative website that people can log on to and identify one tree or however many they've planted and populates these dots on a global map, which is pretty amazing. But the problem is we have way too much excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we need to reduce it very rapidly. So there's a lab in Switzerland at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and it's run by an amazing 33-year-old gentleman who grew up in Great Britain. His name is Thomas Crowther, Crowther. So the Crowther Lab decided to see how many trees do we need to plant, and more importantly, where could we plant them on the face of the globe, and could we do it rapidly? So they started out by mapping the whole globe in a way that's never been done before to identify the global tree coverage. And what they found is we have about 2.9 billion hectares of tree coverage all around the world. And we have the capacity for 4.4 billion hectares of canopy cover under the current climate situation we have. And now they've done something really important. They've excluded existing trees and agriculture and urban areas. And what they found is that there's room for 0.9 billion hectares of new tree canopy. And they call this strategic reforestation because those places that they've identified where we should focus on planting the trees historically supported trees. So instead of going to the middle of the Sahara Desert where there were trees, but it was over 1,000 years ago,
Right.
they've identified 6 countries. The Soviet Union used to be a huge conglomeration, but in Russia, they have space for about 25% of the trees we need to plant. The United States has 20% of the room. Canada has about 10%. And then they go on to several other countries. Brazil has about 15%. The key is we have the capacity to increase the global tree cover on 0.9 billion hectares of land that could store 205 gigatons of carbon in wood and natural forest soils. And this would bring the excess carbon in the atmosphere 75% back to a level we have not seen since 1930. And this is something that we need to do at the very same time we're reducing our output of new carbon. And it's very, very important. And it involves planting trees. And it involves how would we do that?
Yeah.
Well, number one, we have to organize a large-scale effort. Just the logistics of it are, very big. We're talking like over 200 million acres of land just in the United States. So that's a big project to plant those trees.
Yeah.
But we can do it. And if we do it, if we get it to the point where we're doing this as a major economic investment of humankind to protect our future, it actually will yield great benefits because when we plant trees, we're not talking about just willy-nilly sticking a tree here and sticking a tree there. We're talking about creating new forest ecosystems and growing a variety of trees and also other elements of a forest. We need grass on the ground, we need shrubs, we need intermediate trees, and then we need short, medium, and long-lived trees. And they all come together as a forest ecosystem. And I believe that we need to farm that to make it work. To get the carbon reduction that we're looking for, we're going to need to use very sophisticated organic farming techniques to achieve this goal. And it's an incremental process. When you plant baby trees, you might space them 25 feet apart in rows, and the space between, you can immediately grow a cover crop, for example, and immediately begin sequestering carbon. And on the other side of this, what I'm talking about in microcarbon sequestration is how do we inspire the citizens of our globe to step up and start reducing their carbon output? Well, I believe we do it by inviting them to also step up their carbon sequestration. And we can do that by a simple tune-up of their landscape systems. It might only be 3 potted plants. It might be a garden with 60-plus trees. It would include a lawn and shrubs and other things. And what we can do is we can increase the carbon performance of these microsystems very rapidly. In one day, we would take, for example, a planting bed with shrubs in it. We would prune those shrubs along the ground level so we could get access to the ground.
Right.
We would cultivate that ground. Then we would add like 1 inch of nutritive compost. We would cultivate that in, and then we would put 6 inches of mulch. And we would hopefully make that mulch right there from the prunings that we took out. And then that area will use 25 to 50% less water, but will grow 4 times as vigorously and reduce carbon from the atmosphere.
Wow. So you actually touched on one of my favorite concepts of my permaculture training, and that's called chop and drop. When you, just a moment ago, you said that hopefully that woody mulch would come from the trees that you're pruning. And often what I do here at the urban farm is I'll do pruning, and I'll just take those branches and I drop them right underneath the trees that I'm pruning. Is that a concept that works here?
That is one of the key concepts, because we don't want to spend a lot of extra carbon to do this if we don't have to. So imagine a 1 block long street with residents along both sides. If we organized a workday for that little neighborhood, maybe 20 homes, they could go in and prune everything in their landscape that needs to be pruned for health and safety and fire prevention. We also have to be fire safe because we don't want that excess carbon. They pull those trimmings out to the street, and while they're cultivating the ground and putting the compost in, we pull a chipper shredder down the street, and in front of each house we chip everything that they have clipped and pile it right back so they can take it right back and put it on their landscape. And so there's 2 or 3 residents on that community that are maybe physically challenged or seniors, so that they're very limited mobility. Well, we as neighbors could help tune up their landscape as well. And this tune-up would actually go on every person's individual carbon budget. You know, if this family of 5 tuned up their 60 trees and their whole landscaping, we could calculate how much carbon they're going to sequester each year. And the beauty of it is we're increasing that sequestration almost immediately.
Yeah.
Whereas when we go to plant trees, it's going to take some time while the little baby tree grows to get to be a big tree. So we say the average tree reaches its sort of lifetime productivity at 20 years, and then that can go on depending upon the species. Like some oak trees, cork oak, they plant those, and it takes 50 years before they first harvest the cork, and then every 10 years for 200 years, they can harvest the cork bark off the trees.
Wow!
So it's like we're doing something for our future, and it's especially important if we think about the things that are really precious to you and I, and that is food and good food that you grow. So, number one, we want to encourage people to tune up the plants they already have. And if they have any more space, we're going to encourage them to plant some new trees, and especially to think about what I call the 80-20 plan. I like 80% edible and 20% ornamental, the beautiful flowering tree or the beautiful scented tree, and think about not only fruit but also nuts. And that's in the landscape for our communities. But when we get out to planting millions of acres of trees, we're going to have to create complete ecosystems that generate crops. Some of it might be very fast timber trees, like ash trees can grow to full timber size in 20 years, whereas the oak tree is, like I said, up to 200 years or more in lifetime. So we have a range of things mixed together in an ecosystem. And this also helps to support nature. Our other partners here on the planet, the birds and the bees and the other pollinators and all the animals, all of which we're still trying to figure out the purpose of some of these things.
Right.
For example, ticks and fleas and mosquitoes, I have a really hard time with, but they do have a purpose.
Right.
Just not me.
Yeah, exactly. And you sharing that, on our personal Urban Farm U Facebook page, the headline picture is of Wes Jackson. He's with the Urban Land Institute, isn't he?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I love this quote of his. And this I was reminded of this as you were talking about the cork trees that you're harvesting, 50 years before you ever harvest anything off of them. This quote I love: "If your life's work can be accomplished in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough."
I love it. I live by that.
Yeah, I do too.
I live by that.
I do too. It's really important, and we need to keep our eyes on that. And, how epic can you be thinking? That's really my question for you.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. I believe that we have to step up our action. And I'm doing 2 things to increase this. In my elected job as a resource conservationist, I'm having my conservation district is starting the Technical Assistance Center for Active Carbon Sequestration at Mission Resource Conservation District based in Fallbrook, California. And we want to provide technical assistance not only to the landscape, to the citizens who can tune up their landscape, but how do we organize the logistics of planting 200 million acres of trees? So to do that, I've expanded and we're developing a research center at California State University at Northridge, their Sustainability Institute.
Wow.
We've now opened the Research Center for Active Carbon Sequestration, and we're also having research done on the campus of Whittier College, where we've planted a high-density planting of avocados and coffee as a way to transition the classic college landscape to something new and do carbon sequestration research right there, 100 feet from the science building. And we have a team of researchers working with us at San Diego State, or Cal State San Diego, the University of California, San Diego, and they're helping us look at the logistics of how do we plant 200 million acres of trees. And we need to push these initiatives forward and support this work because it's going to benefit all of us on this globe. But the exciting part is I want to inspire individual citizens to do what they can and to take credit for that and to encourage their neighbors. And once they've tuned up their own landscape, maybe they'll get interested in where they could put in a food forest in their community. And maybe they'll help put in, a forest of at least 10 varieties on lands owned by their city or their county or their state. And we're going to have to all join together in this initiative to basically suck the excess carbon out of the atmosphere and make it useful for us here on the planet.
Yeah. And how does somebody at, living on my street, what are the steps that we can take? Because when you say 200 million acres, that's a little bit mind-boggling. So what can I do at a grassroots level to start addressing this?
That's where we have this concept called microcarbon sequestration. What you do in your landscape there at the urban farm is very complex active carbon sequestration. You have your lawn, you have your growing beds, you have your trees and shrubs, and all of those you keep tuned up and performing at their best. And that's what we're asking the common citizen to do, is to look at their landscape and realize that if they haven't fed their plants 4 times this year, their landscape plants are not growing as vigorously as they could. If they haven't mulched their soil, they're losing water to evaporation directly from the soil, and the root zone of the plants is more challenged. If they cultivate in some nutrients and then cover it with a good 4 to 6 inches of chipped mulch from hopefully right even from their property, the cut and drop method that you talk about, they can increase the health of their trees, reduce the fire susceptibility of their landscape, and increase the performance of their trees. More fruit, more beauty, more flowers, and they'll be making a difference for the whole planet.
Excellent. So it's pretty straightforward. Fertilize your trees, lots of compost, add mulch, and manage the trees just by pruning some of them so that they stay healthy.
Exactly. And also, we want to invite everybody to look at any potential areas in their landscape that they need to clean up to reduce fire danger. And that's very important because when we burn the landscape, we're immediately releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So we're always encouraging people to have a fire-safe home, to not have that firewood stored under a wooden deck, for example, where if an ember blew in there, the deck would go up and the firewood would go up. We need to think carefully about the safety of our landscapes, what we call fire-safe landscape view, and we need to enhance the performance of our landscapes. And this also saves water, which is very important. And the other way we save water is by increasing the ability of your home landscape to harvest rainwater. Do things like channel your roof runoff into a rain barrel or directly into the garden. And that reduces the water you have to buy for your landscape. And if you mulch, you can reduce the overall need of water by up to 50%. And you can reduce the purchase of water dramatically by using the water that comes to your property much more effectively.
Wow, cool. So that is a whole lot of super easy things to do. And we've got Brad Lancaster's been on the podcast, and so you can look up his podcast for rainwater harvesting as well. So that is some great things that people can do on their property. So somebody is listening in a small town or a large city. What is the next step up, the things that they could do to interface with maybe their city government to push something like this forward?
Well, we need to encourage the planting of trees, especially in cities. The statistic that's out is that American cities lose 36 million trees a year. And that's to things like development. Trees actually age out. They get too old and then they die or fall down. When we develop, we take out trees. So we need to not only stop the reduction of trees in our cities where we can, but we need to massively increase the planting of both community gardens and community trees, and then also, regional trees. But one of the most important things is the community garden, because that is a hub of carbon sequestration that releases massive amounts of oxygen every day as it's growing and thriving. And people can go to the garden, spend time in it, and literally get their bodies supercharged with good, clean oxygen. That's pretty amazing.
Nice. So this is a lot of great information. Is there anything else somebody could do to contribute to this?
Well, I think it's very important that people start to take stock of their carbon impact and think about some of the very simple things that they can do to reduce that. Like with our vehicle, if the tires are underinflated, it takes more energy to move the car along. So find out, it says right on your tire, mine say 35 pounds. So I try to keep them at 35 pounds pressure so that the vehicle rolls easier. I keep my oil changed on a regular basis so the engine runs better. I make sure to do tune-ups and things like that so I can reduce the impact. And then think smart, like plan your trips. If you need to go 5 or 6 places, kind of plan a round robin, reduce your vehicle trips. So there are a lot of things that we can do to reduce our impact without giving up all these wonders of our life here in America and on the world.
Nice. So for the first part, we talked about planting trees and what you can do to build carbon sequestration. Now we're touching on what you can actually do to reduce your carbon output.
Yes. So several other things are what we call the low-hanging fruit of this. Many people, we're going into winter, and many people have furnaces that heat their homes. Well, maintain your equipment, change your filter, because if your filter is clogged, it takes twice as much energy to push the heated air through it, and that's more energy. One of the other things my dear wife is always reminding me of is to reduce our phantom energy. A lot of appliances continue to draw current so that they'll do instant on for you.
Yes.
But if we install, simple power strips and you put the TV or the computer, I have a computer and a printer, those I could leave on all the time, or I can shut them off when I'm not using them, and that reduces my power needs. There's other things that we can do, like make sure you're recycling, make sure that you have a clean burning wood stove. This is a whole new movement where we have more and more efficient combustion chambers for wood burning stoves, for example. So you can burn wood for heat, especially wood that you've harvested yourself. That's the best. It heats you twice, once when you cut it and chop it, and once when you heat with it.
There you go.
But also buy local. Buy from a farmer's market. support local farmers, and pay attention to where your food comes from. I used to say that, we'll still be buying coffee and tea from around the world, but maybe in the future we've proven we can grow incredible coffee here in Southern California.
Right.
And I'm also experimenting with growing green tea, but we won't put those places around the world where those industries are thriving out of business, but we will reduce the taking of certain things that are very egregious to the environment. Can you imagine that the growing of cut flowers, for example, used to be a very local business? There used to be greenhouses growing roses around all the big cities on the East Coast. Well, now many roses come from Ecuador or Kenya. And so think about it. When you're purchasing, try to find something local that has a lower carbon footprint. And be thoughtful about how you invest your money and eat more organic food, because organic agriculture is the most high-performing carbon sequestering agriculture. Our conventional agricultural system uses a lot of inputs and chemicals, and those have a very high carbon cost.
Yeah.
And it's the best health care there is to eat good food. Get our nutrients from the food we eat is the very best way to go.
Yeah. And
then
you talked about, before we go past that, you talked about reducing your carbon footprint. And a lot of the things that you just have mentioned directly impacts that. And so it sounds to me like if we just become more conscious about those things and eat locally, the eat locally piece is important, because this time of year, if we're hauling in citrus from Peru, that carbon footprint on that citrus is huge. Whereas in 30 days, we're going to be harvesting citrus off of our own property. So that's what you're talking about, right?
Yes. And I'm saying, please be thoughtful about that. Don't feel like you can't, buy coffee from Kenya, for example, but be thoughtful about it and look for the local citrus. I saw citrus in my store the other day in an area where we grow a lot of citrus here in San Diego County, and they had oranges from Australia.
Right.
I was thinking, oh my goodness, it's wonderful for the business to reach those farmers in Australia, but how can we do better locally? So go to the farmers market and participate in your local community. Visit your local parks. Take a look at them. Does your park need a tune-up? I'll bet it does. And the citizens can help the community by doing work days to tune up the community as well. Tune up our government. It's maybe slowing down and getting rusty, so let's tune it up so it's as efficient as possible and serves the people of the world in the ways that we need. And the bottom line of all of this is not a problem for the United States. This is a problem for every citizen of the world. And we're all in this together. There is no a way for us to throw our excess carbon dioxide.
Right.
We just stick it up in the air right over our heads. It stays there. So think about how you can do things in a way that reduces your impact and lower your carbon footprint. But please also step forward and start to do active sequestration that you are responsible for and that you are doing with your community. And this will inspire our citizens to participate in the process, because they will see that simple steps can make a difference. It's kind of like the old line, oh, my vote doesn't count. Well, the truth is your vote counts. So step up, vote with your dollar, vote for the officials who are meeting your needs, and vote for the planet to sustain humanity for a long, long time into the future.
Wow. Amen to that. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Scott.
It was my pleasure. I hope to inspire people to see that they individually can make a huge difference, and collectively we can all make a difference that will save the planet.
Wow, cool. So let's talk, first of all, how do people find you if they want more information from you?
My email is Scott A. Murray at SBC global.net. Please send me an email. And we have our website. We call it edgeofurbanfarm.com. And you'll see some more of my work there on the website, and you'll be able to contact me through that. And listen to my show number 11 on the Urban Farm Podcast, and listen to my show number 352 on the Urban Farm Podcast.
Nice.
For more inspiration about how to get active and do something that will change your life in a positive way and make the future a better place. It's like the grandfather that plants a cork oak tree or a forest of them. He doesn't plant those for himself.
Right.
He doesn't plant those for his children. He plants those for his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. Imagine that. That's thinking long-term. We need more of that, but right now we need to take action to make a difference and save our future.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. You can also find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/active carbon. Hey, if you've enjoyed this podcast and are interested in listening to my first podcast series, Freshly Green from 2007, you can subscribe to support the Urban Farm Podcast. With that, you will have access to Freshly Green and so much more bonus content. Visit urbanfarmpodcast.org to find out more and to pledge your support.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.